The bridal suite smelled of white roses and hairspray when Josephine Calloway grabbed my wrist so hard her knuckles went white, pulled me into the closet between two garment bags, and whispered 4 words that stopped my heart cold: "Please, help me stop this." 12 minutes. That was all we had before 200 guests would rise to their feet and a string quartet would begin the processional that would tie her to a man she suddenly could not name without her voice cracking. If you believe that people deserve second chances, that courage can arrive in the smallest whispered sentence, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is say, "Stop," when the whole world expects them to say, "I do," then I want you to like this video, leave a comment below about a moment when you found the courage to speak up, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. Our community has grown because people like you believe that kindness and honesty still matter, even when it's terrifying, even when everyone is watching, even when it would be so much easier to stay silent. Now let me tell you what happened in that closet, and what happened after, because I promise you, by the end of this story, you will understand why 12 minutes changed everything. My name is Rosalind Hart, and I had been doing Josephine's hair and makeup since she was 16 years old, back when her mother used to bring her into my little salon on Cedar Street for her school pictures and, later, for her prom. I watched that girl grow from a gap-toothed teenager who hated sitting still into a poised young woman who worked in publishing and had a laugh that could fill a room. I was not just her stylist. I had become, over the years, something closer to family, the kind of person who gets invited to birthday dinners and knows which of her aunts to avoid at holiday parties. So when her mother, Eleanor Calloway, called me 8 months earlier and asked if I would do Josephine's wedding hair and makeup, I said yes before she even finished the sentence, because I loved that girl the way you love a niece you never had, fiercely and without condition. The morning of the wedding began like any wedding morning begins, in a blur of tulle and nerves and too much coffee. The ceremony was to take place at an old stone chapel on the Whitfield family estate, a sprawling property with manicured gardens and a fountain that had been imported, according to the wedding planner, from somewhere in Italy that nobody could quite pronounce correctly. The groom, Grant Whitfield, came from money that had been in his family for 3 generations, the kind of money that built libraries and had its name on hospital wings. Josephine's family, by contrast, had spent the last several years quietly drowning. Her father's small manufacturing business had been failing for a long time, and though nobody said it out loud at family dinners, everyone in that house understood that this wedding was not just a wedding. It was a lifeline. I arrived at the estate at 7 in the morning with my kit of brushes and palettes, and I found Josephine sitting at the vanity in a robe embroidered with her new initials, staring at her own reflection like it belonged to a stranger. She smiled when she saw me, but it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind I had learned over the years to recognize as a mask she wore for her mother's benefit. Eleanor Calloway was already in the room, directing 2 bridesmaids on where to hang the dress, checking her phone every few seconds for messages from the caterer, moving through the space with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had spent 8 months planning every single detail of this day and would not tolerate a single thing going wrong. I began working on Josephine's hair, weaving small white flowers into loose curls the way she had asked, and for the first hour, everything felt ordinary. We talked about nothing in particular. She asked about my daughter's college applications. I asked whether she was nervous, and she said the thing that brides always say, that of course she was nervous, that it was normal, that every bride feels this way. But as the morning wore on, I began to notice things. Small things. The way her hands trembled slightly when she lifted her coffee cup. The way she kept glancing at the door every time it opened, as though she were waiting for someone, or dreading someone. The way she flinched, almost imperceptibly, when her mother mentioned Grant's name, saying something about how his family had flown in relatives from London and Grant wanted everything to be perfect for them. I had done enough weddings in my career to know the difference between ordinary bridal jitters and something else, something heavier sitting beneath the surface. I had seen brides cry happy tears while getting their makeup done, laughing through the mascara smudges. This was different. Josephine's eyes, when I caught them in the mirror, looked like the eyes of someone standing at the edge of something she could not see the bottom of. Around 9:30, her mother stepped out of the room to deal with a crisis involving the flower arrangements, and for the first time all morning, Josephine and I were alone except for one bridesmaid, her cousin Delphine, who was asleep on the chaise lounge in the corner, exhausted from the previous night's rehearsal dinner. Josephine turned to me in the mirror and asked, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it over the hum of my curling iron, whether I had ever been afraid of doing the right thing. I remember pausing, the iron still warm in my hand, and asking her what she meant. She didn't answer right away. She just looked down at her own hands, at the engagement ring that had been in the Whitfield family for 4 generations, a ring so large it seemed to weigh down her entire finger, and she said that sometimes she felt like she was watching her own life happen to someone else, like she was a passenger in a car she wasn't driving. I told her that sounded like something worth talking about, and she said, quickly, too quickly, that she was just tired, that weddings were exhausting, that she would be fine once the ceremony started. I let it go, because that is what you do when someone tells you they are fine and you are not entirely sure you have the right to push further. But the feeling stayed with me, a small stone lodged somewhere in my chest, all through the rest of the morning as the room filled up again with bridesmaids and photographers and Eleanor Calloway's increasingly frantic energy. The photographer wanted candid shots of Josephine looking out the window, wistful and beautiful in the morning light, and I watched through my own reflection in the mirror as she posed for those photographs with a smile that had been rehearsed, practiced, performed. I had spent 13 years learning to read faces for a living, learning which muscles moved when a person felt something real and which moved when they were simply going through motions, and what I saw on Josephine's face that morning was a woman going through motions. By 11 o'clock, the dress was on. It was a beautiful gown, ivory silk with delicate lace sleeves that had belonged to Grant's grandmother, altered to fit Josephine's frame, and when she stood in front of the full-length mirror, the room erupted into the kind of gasping, tearful admiration that brides are supposed to receive. Delphine cried. The other bridesmaids cried. Eleanor Calloway, who I had never once seen show visible emotion in all the years I had known her, pressed her fingers to her lips and said that Josephine looked like a queen. And Josephine stood there in that dress, in that room full of people who loved her, and she looked, for just a moment, like she might actually cry too, until I saw her eyes catch on something out the window, something in the garden below, and her face went pale in a way that had nothing to do with joy. I followed her gaze and saw Grant Whitfield down in the garden, dressed in his tuxedo, laughing with his groomsmen, clapping one of them on the back. He was, by any objective measure, a handsome man, tall and broad-shouldered with the kind of practiced charm that made people feel important when he spoke to them. I had met him only a handful of times over the past 8 months, at fittings and family dinners, and each time I had come away with an impression I could not quite articulate, something about the way his eyes moved when he spoke to Josephine, assessing rather than adoring, the way he sometimes finished her sentences for her in a manner that felt less like intimacy and more like correction. I had mentioned this once to my own daughter, in passing, and she had told me I was being paranoid, that not every confident man was hiding something, and I had told myself she was probably right, because what did I know, really, beyond the surface of people's lives that I only glimpsed in the hour or two I spent painting their faces before the most important days of their lives. At 11:48, with the ceremony scheduled to begin at 12 o'clock sharp, Eleanor Calloway left the room one final time to check on the seating arrangement for Grant's grandmother, who apparently had very specific requirements about proximity to the aisle. The bridesmaids filed out behind her, chattering, adjusting their own hair, leaving Josephine and me alone in the suite for what I assumed would be the final quiet moment before the whirlwind of the ceremony began. I was fixing a stray curl near her temple, my fingers gentle against her scalp, when she reached up and grabbed my wrist, her grip sudden and fierce, and pulled me toward the small walk-in closet at the side of the room where the garment bags hung. She shut the door most of the way, leaving only a sliver of light, and in that cramped, fabric-scented darkness, she looked at me with an expression I will never forget as long as I live, an expression of pure, unguarded terror, and she said the words that would change the course of that entire day. Please, help me stop this. I want to pause here, because I think it's important for anyone listening to understand what that moment actually felt like, not as a dramatic twist in a story, but as a real, human collision between two people who loved each other and had run out of time. 12 minutes. I looked at the small gold watch on my wrist, the one my own late mother had given me, and I did the math instantly, instinctively, the way you calculate distances when you're driving and see a light about to change. 12 minutes until the doors of that chapel opened and 200 people stood to watch Josephine Calloway walk toward a life she had just told me, in a whisper thick with panic, that she could not go through with. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage with my own pulse hammering in my throat, what was wrong, what had happened, whether someone had hurt her. She shook her head quickly, tears now spilling over despite her best efforts to hold them back, ruining the careful work I had done on her eye makeup not 20 minutes before, and she told me it wasn't one thing. It was everything. It was the fact that she had known, somewhere in the quiet part of herself she had been ignoring for months, that she did not love Grant Whitfield the way a person is supposed to love the person they marry. It was the fact that she had said yes to his proposal not because her heart had leapt but because her mother had wept with relief when she heard the news, because the wedding date had been set before Josephine had fully processed what she was agreeing to, because somewhere along the way the engagement had stopped being about her feelings and started being about her family's survival. She told me, in fragments, the things she had never said out loud to anyone, not even to Delphine, who she trusted more than almost anyone in the world. She told me that her father's business was 3 months from bankruptcy, that Grant's family had quietly offered to invest, to save the company, to save her parents from losing the house they had lived in for 30 years, and that this offer had been made, subtly but unmistakably, in the context of the engagement, as though the marriage and the money were 2 threads of the same rope. She told me that Grant was not cruel, not exactly, that he had never raised his voice to her or laid a hand on her, but that he had a way of making her feel small in rooms full of people, correcting her opinions at dinner parties, introducing her to his colleagues as though she were an accessory rather than a partner, and that every time she had tried to talk to him about how this made her feel, he had told her she was being too sensitive, that she was imagining things, that she should be grateful for everything he was providing her. She told me that over the past 8 months, she had slowly stopped recognizing her own voice in conversations, had started deferring to his opinions even about small things like what to order at restaurants, had felt herself shrinking, day by day, into a smaller and smaller version of the woman she used to be. And she told me, finally, the thing that seemed to frighten her most of all, that she had tried, twice, to tell her mother she wasn't sure about the marriage, and both times Eleanor had cried, actually wept, and told Josephine that she was the only hope this family had left, that if she called off the wedding now, after everything, after the invitations had gone out and the deposits had been paid and Grant's family had already begun the paperwork for the investment, she would be destroying not just her own future but her parents' entire lives. I stood there in that closet holding this trembling young woman I had known since she was 16, and I felt something in my chest crack open, because I understood, in that moment, exactly the trap she had walked into, a trap built not out of malice but out of love, out of desperation, out of a family's quiet unraveling and a daughter's willingness to sacrifice herself to hold it together. I had seen this pattern before in my own life, though not in these exact circumstances. Years earlier, when my husband had first gotten sick, I had made a series of choices about my own career, my own dreams, that I told myself were temporary sacrifices for the good of my family, and it had taken me nearly a decade to admit to myself that some of those sacrifices had cost me pieces of myself I never got back. I did not tell Josephine any of this in that moment, because there wasn't time, but I felt the weight of my own history pressing against hers, and I understood that whatever I said in the next few minutes might be the only honest thing anyone had said to her in months. I asked her the only question that mattered. I asked her if she loved him. Not whether he was a good provider, not whether her family needed the money, not whether calling off the wedding would be humiliating or complicated or expensive, but simply whether, underneath all of it, she loved Grant Whitfield the way a person deserves to love the one they are about to promise their life to. She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I could hear the string quartet beginning to warm up somewhere below us, the soft, mournful notes of a violin drifting up through the open window, and then she said no. Just that. No. And something about the simplicity of that single word, spoken without hesitation once she finally allowed herself to say it, told me everything I needed to know about how long she had been carrying this truth alone. I want to tell you that I knew immediately what to do, that I had some perfect plan ready to unfold, but the truth is that I was as frightened as she was, standing in that closet with 11 minutes left on the clock, aware that whatever happened next would ripple outward into the lives of 200 guests, 2 families, and a young woman's entire future. But I also knew, with a clarity that surprised me, that my job in that moment was not to make the decision for her. It was to make sure she knew she was allowed to make it herself. I took her by the shoulders, careful not to smudge the dress, and I told her that no one, not her mother, not Grant, not the 200 people sitting in that chapel, had the right to make her walk down an aisle toward a life she did not choose with her whole heart. I told her that her parents' financial troubles were real and serious, but that they were not hers to fix by sacrificing the rest of her life, and that if her mother truly loved her, she would rather see her daughter unmarried and whole than married and disappearing a little more each year. I told her that fear was not the same as certainty, and that the fact that she was terrified did not mean she was wrong to be terrified, and I told her, finally, that whatever she decided in the next 10 minutes, would stand beside her, because that was what family did, and in the years I had known her, she had become mine. She cried harder then, but something in her posture shifted, some of the rigidity leaving her shoulders, and she asked me, in a small voice, how she was even supposed to do this, how a person calls off a wedding 12 minutes before it starts without destroying everything and everyone in the process. I did not have a perfect answer. I told her the truth, which was that there was no clean way to do this, no version of the next hour that would not involve pain and confusion and hard conversations, but that there was a difference between a wound that heals and a wound that festers for the rest of your life, and that walking down that aisle today would create the second kind. I told her that her mother's disappointment, however sharp it would feel in this moment, would fade in time, especially once Eleanor understood the alternative, which was watching her daughter live a diminished life for the next 50 years. And I told her that if she wanted, I would go with her right now to find her mother, because this was not a conversation she should have to have alone, and because whatever else happened, I was not going to let her face this by herself. At that moment, the closet door opened fully, and Delphine stood there, having woken from her nap and wandered over to see why we had disappeared. She took one look at Josephine's tear-streaked face, at the mascara running in dark lines down her cheeks, at the way her cousin's whole body seemed to be shaking, and her own face crumpled with alarm. She asked what was wrong, and before I could say anything, Josephine told her cousin the truth, the same truth she had just told me, in halting, broken sentences that grew steadier as she spoke them a second time, as though saying it aloud twice made it more real, more solid, more something she could actually act on rather than just feel. Delphine, to her enormous credit, did not gasp or panic or tell Josephine she was making a mistake. She simply took her cousin's hand, the one not currently gripping mine, and said that she loved her no matter what she decided, and that if Josephine needed someone to help her figure out what to do next, she was there too. With 3 of us now standing in that small closet, the clock ticking down toward 8 minutes, we made a decision together that felt less like a grand rebellious gesture and more like the only sane thing left to do. We would not let Josephine walk down that aisle. Not because a wedding stopped is automatically the right choice, not because every case of cold feet deserves to end in a cancelled ceremony, but because this was not cold feet. This was a young woman who had spent months slowly disappearing under the weight of other people's expectations, finally finding the words to say she could not do this, and the 3 of us agreed that the very least we owed her, as the people who loved her most in that building, was to help her be heard. The next few minutes moved with a strange, dreamlike speed, the way time does in moments of crisis, both impossibly fast and impossibly slow. Delphine went to find Eleanor Calloway, because someone needed to tell her before the doors opened, and I stayed behind with Josephine, helping her sit down, giving her water, doing what small things I could to steady her breathing, which had grown ragged and shallow with the effort of holding back sobs that no longer needed to be held back. I remember thinking, in that strange suspended moment, about all the years I had spent doing brides' hair and makeup, about how much of that work is really about helping women perform a version of themselves for a single, heavily photographed day, and how rarely anyone in that industry stops to ask whether the woman underneath the veil actually wants to be standing where she is standing. I thought about my own daughter, about what I would want someone to do for her if she ever found herself in a closet like this one, and I knew, without any doubt, that I was doing the right thing, even though every rational part of my brain kept reminding me of the chaos that was about to unfold below us. Eleanor Calloway arrived at the door of the bridal suite 4 minutes later, her face a mixture of confusion and dawning dread, because Delphine had only told her that something was wrong, not what, wanting Josephine to have the chance to explain it herself. When Eleanor saw her daughter sitting there in that beautiful, ruined dress, mascara streaked down her face, she rushed to her side, and for a moment I watched a mother's instinct override everything else, the wedding, the money, the guests, as she knelt down and asked Josephine what had happened, whether she was hurt, whether someone had done something to her. And Josephine, drawing on some reserve of courage that I believe had been building in her, unnoticed, for months, looked her mother directly in the eyes and told her the truth. She told her she could not marry Grant. She told her she did not love him, had perhaps never really loved him in the way a marriage requires, and that she had been trying to convince herself otherwise for months because she could not bear the thought of disappointing the people she loved most. She told her mother about the investment offer, about how it had become tangled up with the engagement in a way that made it impossible for her to know anymore whether she was choosing this marriage or simply being carried along by circumstances too large for her to resist. And she told her, with a directness that clearly cost her enormous effort, that she loved her parents, that she understood what was at stake for the family, but that she could not sacrifice the rest of her life to fix a problem that was not hers to solve alone. I watched Eleanor Calloway's face during this confession, and I want to tell you honestly that it was not a simple transformation. There was shock first, and something that looked almost like anger, the reflexive anger of a woman whose careful plans were collapsing in real time, whose reputation among her friends and Grant's family was about to be shattered in the space of a few sentences. She started to say something about the guests, about the money already spent, about what people would think, and I saw Josephine flinch, saw her start to fold back into herself the way she must have folded 100 times before during the past 8 months. But then something shifted in Eleanor's face, something I don't think I fully understood until much later, when Josephine told me more about her mother's own history, about the marriage Eleanor herself had entered into decades earlier under different but not entirely dissimilar pressures, about the man she had almost married before she found the courage to leave him at the 11th hour. A story she had never told her own daughter because she had buried it so deeply she almost believed it had happened to someone else. Whatever memory surfaced in Eleanor Calloway in that moment, it stopped her mid-sentence, and instead of finishing her thought about the guests and the money, she reached out and took her daughter's face in her hands, and she said, in a voice thick with an emotion I had never once heard from this composed, controlled woman, that she was sorry, that she had let her own fear about the business cloud her judgment about what actually mattered, and that if Josephine did not love Grant, then nothing else in that chapel mattered at all. I will not pretend that everything resolved itself neatly in that instant, because it did not. There were still 200 guests downstairs, a groom in a tuxedo who had no idea his life was about to change in the next 5 minutes, a wedding planner who would need to be told, caterers with trays of food ready to be served, and an entire elaborate machinery of celebration that had been set into motion months earlier and now needed, somehow, to be stopped. But something essential had shifted in that room, a permission had been granted, not by me, not really, but by Josephine finally allowing herself to say the truth out loud to the person whose approval she had feared losing most, and finding, against all her fears, that her mother's love did not depend on her walking down that aisle. With 6 minutes left, Eleanor Calloway did something I will remember for the rest of my life. She stood up, smoothed her own dress, and told Josephine that she would go speak to the wedding planner and figure out how to handle the guests, that this was not Josephine's burden to carry alone, that a mother's job was to protect her child even when protection looked different than she had imagined it would. She asked only one thing, gently, without pressure, which was whether Josephine wanted to speak to Grant herself, or whether she wanted someone else to do it. Josephine, wiping her face with the back of her hand, said that she needed to tell him herself, because he deserved that much honesty even if nothing else about the past 8 months had been fully honest, and because she needed to hear herself say the words to him in order to believe they were real. What happened next was not a scene of shouting or dramatic accusations, though I think many people expect these moments to unfold that way, full of raised voices and slammed doors. Instead, Eleanor arranged for Grant to be brought quietly to a small sitting room adjacent to the chapel, away from the guests, under the pretense of a minor scheduling issue, and Josephine, with Delphine and me standing just outside the door for support, went in to speak with him alone. I did not hear everything that was said in that room, because Josephine had asked for privacy, and I respected that, but I heard enough through the door to understand the shape of the conversation. I heard Grant's voice rise in disbelief, then in something that sounded almost like anger, though he never raised it to a shout, the same controlled, condescending tone that Josephine had described to me in the closet, the tone of a man more concerned with his own embarrassment than with his fiancée's well-being. I heard him ask whether this was about the investment, whether she was trying to renegotiate terms, as though her heart were a business matter that could be restructured, and I heard Josephine's voice, steadier now than it had been all morning, tell him no, that this was not a negotiation, that she was ending the engagement because she did not love him and could not spend the rest of her life pretending otherwise. When Josephine emerged from that room 11 minutes after the ceremony had been scheduled to begin, she was pale but composed, and there was something in her posture I had not seen all morning, a straightness in her spine that had nothing to do with the boning in her wedding dress. Grant did not follow her out. I learned later, through the strange, efficient grapevine that exists at every large gathering, that he left the estate within the hour, his family trailing behind him in a flurry of confused and increasingly hostile whispers, and that the investment offer, unsurprisingly, was withdrawn within the week. I want to be honest with you about this part of the story, because I think it matters. Josephine's decision to stop that wedding did not magically solve her family's financial problems. Her father's business still struggled. There were hard conversations in the months that followed about what would happen to the house, about whether they would need to sell it, about how the family would rebuild without the safety net that marriage into the Whitfield family would have provided. I do not want you to walk away from this story thinking that courage always comes with a neat financial reward, because that would be a lie, and this story deserves better than a lie at its center. What did happen, in the weeks and months after that day, was something quieter but I think ultimately more valuable than money. Josephine moved back into her childhood bedroom for a time, not out of failure but out of necessity, and in that small, familiar room, she began the slow work of rediscovering who she was outside of the shrinking, deferring version of herself she had become during her engagement. She started going to therapy, something she later told me she should have done years earlier, and she began to understand the patterns that had made it so difficult for her to trust her own instincts, patterns that traced back further than Grant, back to a childhood where her opinions had often been overridden by louder, more confident voices in the room. She reconnected with old friends she had drifted from during the engagement, friends Grant had subtly discouraged her from spending time with. She threw herself back into her work at the publishing house, and within a year, she had been promoted to a position she had wanted for a long time but had stopped pursuing during her engagement because Grant had suggested her career should take a back seat to his once they were married. Eleanor Calloway, too, went through her own quiet transformation in the months that followed. I saw her several times during that period, because Josephine and I remained close, and I watched a woman who had spent decades building an identity around appearances and control slowly begin to soften, to ask her daughter more questions and offer fewer directives, to talk, eventually, about her own broken almost engagement decades earlier, the one she had never told anyone about, not even her husband, and how she had buried that memory so deeply that she had forgotten, until she watched her own daughter standing at the edge of the same cliff, what it had cost her to almost make the same mistake herself, and what it had cost her, differently, to escape it. Mother and daughter grew closer in that difficult year than they had been in a very long time, and I think both of them would tell you now that the wedding that never happened gave them something far more valuable than the wedding that had been planned. I want to pause the story here for a moment, because I think this is exactly the point where the lesson of this whole experience becomes clear, and I would love for you to sit with it before we reach the ending. If this story is touching something in you right now, if you are thinking of a moment in your own life when you almost said yes to something your heart was quietly screaming no to, or a moment when you found the courage to stop, even at the very last minute, even when everyone around you expected you to keep going, I want you to leave a comment below and tell us about it. Our community has been built on stories exactly like this one, stories about the small, terrifying, beautiful moments when someone chooses honesty over ease, and I read every single comment, and I promise you that your story matters just as much as Josephine's does. And if this story has moved you even a little, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone in your life who might need to hear that it is never too late to stop and ask yourself whether you are living a life you actually chose, and subscribe to our channel so that you are here with our family for the next story, because there is always another one. Now let me tell you how this story ends, because I think you deserve to know, and I think the ending is the part that has stayed with me the longest. About 14 months after that day in the closet, Josephine called me and asked if I would be willing to do her hair for a much smaller occasion, a dinner she was hosting to celebrate her father finally paying off the last of the business debt, a milestone the family had reached not through a wealthy marriage but through 2 years of careful restructuring. A small business loan Josephine herself had helped negotiate using skills she had picked up in her publishing career, and a level of family teamwork that Eleanor later told me she did not know they were capable of until they had no choice but to find out. I arrived at the Calloway house that evening, the same house I had visited 100 times over the years, and I found Josephine in the kitchen instead of at a vanity, laughing with her mother over a pot of something on the stove, and when she turned to greet me, I saw immediately that the woman standing in front of me bore very little resemblance to the pale, trembling bride I had left in that closet over a year earlier. Her eyes were clear. Her laugh, when it came, was unguarded, filling the whole room the way it used to when she was 16 years old sitting in my salon chair complaining about her school photos. She told me, while I worked on her hair for that much smaller, much happier celebration, that she had started seeing someone new about 6 months earlier, a man named Theodore who taught high school history and drove a car that was, by her own laughing description, an absolute embarrassment, nothing at all like the polished world she had almost married into. She said that what she loved most about him was that he asked her opinion about things and then actually waited to hear the answer, that he had never once made her feel small in a room full of people, that being with him felt less like performing a role and more like simply being herself, tired and messy and opinionated and whole. She was not engaged to him yet, she told me, and she was in no hurry, because she had learned, the hard way, the difference between love that asks you to shrink and love that gives you room to grow, and she wanted to be sure, this time, before she made any promises at all. Before I left that evening, Eleanor Calloway pulled me aside in the hallway, much as her daughter had pulled me aside in that closet over a year before, though this time there was no panic in her grip, only gratitude. She told me that she had never properly thanked me for what I did that day, for staying with Josephine in that closet instead of rushing to fix my own schedule or protect my own reputation as the hairdresser whose bride never made it down the aisle, for treating her daughter's fear as something worth listening to instead of something to be managed and smoothed over. She told me that she thought about that day often, about how close she had come to letting her own fear about money and appearances push her daughter into a life of quiet diminishment, and she said that she was grateful, every single day, that Josephine had found the courage to speak, and that I had been there to help her find the words when she needed them most. I think about that conversation often myself, and I think about what it means to be the person someone trusts with their most frightened, unguarded truth. I did not save Josephine Calloway that day, not really. She saved herself, in the end, by finding the courage to say 4 words that must have felt, in that moment, like the hardest words she had ever spoken. What I did, and what I think all of us can do for the people we love, was simply refuse to let her feel alone in that moment, refuse to rush her toward a decision that wasn't fully hers, and remind her, at the exact instant she needed reminding most, that her voice mattered, that her fear was information rather than weakness, and that the people who truly love us would rather see us whole and unmarried than beautifully dressed and disappearing. Before I go, I want to ask you something, because I think it matters more than anything else I could say to close out this story. Think about a time in your own life when you were standing at the edge of a decision that everyone around you seemed to expect, a decision that looked right from the outside but felt wrong somewhere deep in your chest, and think about whether you found the courage to listen to that feeling, or whether you pushed it down because it seemed too late, too complicated, too disruptive to everyone else's plans. I want you to leave a comment below and tell our community what that moment taught you, because I believe, with my whole heart, that these stories we share with each other, honestly and without judgment, are how we remind one another that it is never actually too late to choose the truth, even 12 minutes before the doors are about to open. If this story touched your heart today, please take a moment to like this video, leave a meaningful comment about the lesson you're taking away from Josephine's story, share it with someone in your life who might need permission to trust their own doubts, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story about kindness, forgiveness, hope, and the second chances that are waiting for all of us, even in our most frightened moments. Josephine Calloway did not walk down that aisle 14 months ago, and today she is building a life that actually belongs to her, filled with a mother who listens more than she directs, a family that rebuilt itself through honest work instead of borrowed money, and a quiet, unhurried love that asks nothing of her except to keep being exactly who she is. Sometimes the bravest thing we ever do is whisper 4 words to the one person we trust to hear them, and sometimes those 4 words are the beginning of an entire life we never knew we were allowed to want. Thank you for spending this time with our family today, and I will see you in the next story.